welcome to all the esteemed guests on the occasion of release of the vision document increasing India's electronic exports and share in the global value chains. Our Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji on 6th August 2021 gave a clarion call on local goes global while addressing the heads of India's mission abroad and stakeholders in the trade and commerce sector. He emphasized the need to increase India's share in the global supply chains, set up export hubs in the states, build a seamless and high-quality supply chain within the country, and achieve growth of our share in the global value chain. With this mission in mind, we start the event with opening remarks from Sri Pankaj Mohindru, Chairman, India Cellular and Electronics Association, ICA.
Honorable Minister, Secretary Mr. Sani, Rajiv, Ketan and Hariomji, Joint Secretary Mr. Saurabh. I just remembered what our situation of our industry was in 2014. We were literally knocked out at that time. Manufacturing had completely collapsed. In 2014-15, all we did was 60 million phones and a value of about 18,000-19,000 crores. So we've come a long way, and we got pretty smug in between. We had grown about 700-800% on this number, and that time we realized two things. Actually, the Honorable Prime Minister, made us jump out of our skin when he said that we want to be number one in the world. So first we thought we didn't hear him right, because we in fact pointed out to him that we had reached about 13-14% of world manufacturing and our neighboring country was at 75%. So number one looked audacious, to say the least. But he was relentless in that vision, and the NPE 2019 then crystallized this with a number of 190 billion value production and exports of 1 billion. During that course, we also realized that, we are smug enough that we are feeling very good about it, that there's been a lot of growth, etc. But the entire sector has to fire together, which means that mobile phones in isolation cannot become a world champion category. It will have to be a secular, horizontal growth of all verticals in mobile phones, IT hardware, consumer electronics. And when Shri Rajiv Chandrasekhar took over in partnership, my team in partnership with us, decided to come out with this vision document. So my colleagues, Harsh and Meena from Ek Who earlier also done a very exemplary report with us, which we get a lot of credit for, which was the very granular level of disability with tremendous amount of research from China and Vietnam. So they will be giving you a very detailed presentation. The situation at the moment, the last 1.5 years have not been completely lost. The pandemic was very bad. So what we were expecting should happen by 25-26 now will get pushed by about a year or two, definitely. But I think the efforts to reach a certain milestone is very, very determined. So that, I think, is going to happen. What Harsh and Veena will also cover is some very deep facts about the situation. Some myths need to be busted. Our mindset, which, my favorite question these days is not what is the export from China, but what is the imports in China. And I think this Harsh and Veena will address that. That how do you become a part of the global value chains and what is required? this obsession we have about value addition per se may not necessarily be the best thing. So it is the circular global value chains which bring the complete impact on this. So I'll end my opening remarks with this, and I'll request Harsh, and I think that's the program. Maybe the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for setting the context. I request Dr. Harshvardhan Singh, Chairman, Ekadhwaj Advisors, to give a presentation on the vision document.
Good afternoon.
Sir, Mike. Okay, sir.
Good afternoon, Honorable Minister, Mr. Secretary, other distinguished members of the panel, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. This was a joint work of Dr. Veena Jha and myself. So we will cover half and half approximately of the previous issues. I will begin immediately with the thank you. So the Prime Minister, in a very important speech, in my view, about exports, connection with global value chains, and increasing the scale manifold of production of manufacturing in India, in which he emphasized electronics, and within electronics, mobile phones in particular. So the vision strategy of the Prime Minister, in that background, talks about integrating India to a much larger extent into the global value chains, export promotion, increase in scale, using incentive schemes which are WTO compliant. All of you might recall that the MEIS scheme was found WTO inconsistent, and the government came with a replacement for that. So the emphasis is that we must give stability of expectation to the investors, and therefore use WTO compliance schemes. In that process, the idea is also that India itself should become a center of large part of the total global value chain by producing the significant portion domestically. And in order to do that, India has to be competitive, both in terms of price and quality. Another very important element is that only having parts of the value chain, a little bit here, a little bit there, doesn't really make India get the momentum which is required for the vision of the Prime Minister. We need to create and nurture a domestic ecosystem, which comprises both global firms, because global firms are a very important part of this, operating in India, and domestic firms, including creation of domestic champions. So how to integrate India into the global value chains, which from now on I'll refer to as GVCs. Particularly we are talking about electronics, so nearly 80% of electronic exports are linked to GVCs. Share of India's total GVC exports in global exports, total exports, is only about 1.5%. Different stages for inputs and tasks in a GVC. This is the peculiarity of a global value chain, that different tasks and inputs come from different parts of the world. The GVCs have three principal actors, and another very important one. One is a lead firm, which is a large firm, a global firm normally, but not always, which manages the activity of global value chain. Contract manufacturers, which feed into the lead firms, and platform leaders, which create the platforms, the technical platforms on which the whole production process works. Very important part of this are also the tier 1 to tier 3 suppliers, because if you don't have that, you really don't have the chain. And Tier 1 to Tier 3 suppliers are, empirical evidence shows, they are major drivers of innovation and skill development, something which is essential for developing the domestic ecosystem. So national policies to promote GVCs, they will be facilitating policies, open trade and investment policies. They relate to tariffs, trade facilitations, improving logistics, a point which the PM emphasized very greatly, and work on that has already been underway. Infrastructure, again, PM's emphasis. FDI, skill development, and the labor market upgradation. What this requires, because inputs come from abroad, they are then processed and they are sold again, is lower tariffs on inputs, vis-a-vis competitive investment destinations in particular. India tends to have higher on the inputs also, and in order to become more price competitive, that is an area worth focusing on. The frame of reference has to be about, in PLI you have 5 years to 8 years kind of in different sectors. So the first 4 years, you have to build the domestic ecosystem by getting the lead firms, the component suppliers, and the Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers to focus on scale. Because unless you have scale, you will not be competitive. Unless you have scale, you will not link up with large parts of the domestic market to have a large impact, as well as exports. Production capacities, by capacities I mean the capability or the skill or ability to really perform competitively, both technologically and in a price manner. Skills have to improve. All this takes time. This is the way those who have become large exporters in the world today have gone up. In fact, they are still doing that. China is ahead. Vietnam is behind that, but they have increased their domestic value addition ratio. And these are two different concepts we can talk about later. They have increased them over time. But what they are focused on is increasing the domestic value addition in aggregate. So if there is scale, a large part of the domestic activity actually produces that product and links up with the value chain. And developing design capability, something which even the Indian firms which are leading in this sector, they emphasize very much. And as you know, in a technology-intensive industry, this is essential. So, what have major exporting economies done that have led the way for this market, which has grown tremendously? One, they have followed policies which effectively give them a cost advantage compared to the Indian producer exporters. What we had calculated earlier, the estimate range for Vietnam, if the idea is, suppose we implement the policies implemented by Vietnam and India, how much does each policy contribute to a reduction in costs? The aggregate number range, depending on different assumptions, 9.4 to 12.6 for Vietnam, and very much higher, 19.2 to 21.7. This includes subsidies, income tax, land prices, availability, timeline of decision making, etc. So there are some remaining disabilities which are not reflected in this. One is the intermediate inputs. Some of them have seen an increase in tariffs. That then raises costs. Then when you shift your value chain, your global value chain, or the lead firm shifts to India, you will recall that when US-China trade tension was there, our focus was to get that investment to India, and we have managed to get a significant amount. But just one large firm coming doesn't create a value chain. The Tier 1 to Tier 3 suppliers must also come together. That's when you start the activity flow and achieve large result in a relatively short while. And PLI is a very important scheme which the government of India has come up with. So in order to have a maximizing impact of the PLI, We need fast clearances at ports, visas for foreign nationals who are linked to the GVC. Domestic trade policies have to see, are we making those policies in such a way that increase the burden on PLI or reduce the effective subsidy, or are we actually adding to it through facilitation? And for the last part of the electronic industry, air cargo is what the industry relies on, especially for exports. And one has to see these key prices because they then contribute to your competitiveness also. One issue which I had mentioned earlier was WTO compliant policies. Certain policies are prohibited under the WTO. And one is export subsidies. The MEIS scheme was one such. Local content requirement, if you encourage it, in comparison to the policies which impact imports. And tariffs becoming higher than what you have promised within the WTO. So each country has agreed to certain kind of levels which they will not exceed. So these are three normally prohibitive measures, but there are a number which are actually facilitating, they allow the industry to grow. One is PLI. Within PLI is a WTO consistent subsidy. So production subsidy is WTO consistent. RODTEP, the remission of taxes on duties and taxes on exported products. The indirect taxes along the supply chain actually can be remitted completely under WTO. So RODTEP is trying to do that. One has to see that the advantage is fully given. And then there are various kinds of policies like general subsidies for R&D, support for a generic support for small, medium enterprises, infrastructure support, etc. So now I'll give the floor to Dr. Veena.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Minister, Mr. Kantakji, and all, and Mr. Sawniji, and everyone else on the dais. Some of you I know personally, and it's a great pleasure to work with you, especially the ICEA and Hariom Raiji, who we have had the opportunity to work with. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'll try to demystify some of the concepts of value addition and aggregate value. Can you put this slide, please? So there are two concepts which are critically important in this context. One is the aggregate domestic value addition, and the second is domestic value addition ratio. The value addition ratio follows a different trajectory in a global value chain compared to the aggregate domestic value addition. If the domestic value addition is low, even then the aggregate domestic value addition can be high if the scale of exports is large. Hence, there should be a focus on scale and not on the ratio so much. This is the strategy that is followed by China and Vietnam. Vietnam currently has something like 21% value addition, which is much higher than ours. And China currently has between 30 and 50%, depending on the complexity and the technology used in the product. The logic of this is that when you move to higher technology products, generally you import most of the inputs because the inputs have to be of a high technological quality. If you use domestic inputs, then generally if you start with the use of domestic inputs, you can become non-competitive in this market. You have to scale up your skills and technology to become competitive in this market. So the cycle that you see over here is first scale, then exports, and attracting GVCs and their ecosystem. These two together build competitiveness. And with competitiveness, you can lower the tariffs because you develop domestic capacity. And then with lower tariffs, you also attract GVC and supply chain management investments. This together builds the local ecosystem. So this is a chain that has been followed in most countries. And in fact, there's an economist called Gerefi, who actually from Duke University devised this chain, and this has been found to work in most countries. So what should India do to get higher value addition? It should follow this route. What should India not do? It should not put high thresholds for domestic value addition ratio, because what it will do is it will lock the technological development. That is, we'll stay at one stage of technological development and will be unable to move further because we won't be importing the relevant inputs that we need. Then we should reduce the potential for scale, and if we lock DVAR, then we will reduce the potential for scale and exports in the initial phase. So what we shouldn't do is we shouldn't put a threshold for DVAR. What we should do is encourage scale and encourage exports. How can we build domestic champions? Most of them are medium to large scale firms, and as Hariom Raiji informed us, that India could become very competitive in the less than $200 phone market and exports abroad. So domestic firms can play a very important role in the supply chain for GVCs because they develop technologies. Even if it is for less than $200 mobile phones, they will develop technologies and expertise which will be used through the value chain. Then small enterprises actually need big markets. They cannot flourish by themselves. They need to be linked with large GVCs and with large domestic firms. Therefore, the presence of domestic champions is very essential to develop the small firms. Then there is a strong potential of a symbiotic relationship between global firms and domestic champions. And this relationship has to be nurtured. Then policies which support global firms will also help domestic firms. They're not kind of silos of policies, or there is no modularity of policy as there is in the global value chains. So these would be also relevant for the domestic champions, and the policies would rely on encouraging exports, encouraging GVCs, encouraging domestic value addition aggregates. What are the problems and challenges faced by domestic champions? The first we narrowed down on was predatory pricing from competitors with very deep pockets. So what happens is that when the domestic firm is trying to stand up, competition, especially predatory pricing by competitors, can really bring them down. And it's very difficult to survive if access is blocked to important parts of the value chain. So, for example, if value chains have stipulations and of this much domestic value added or whatever, and then the domestic firms will not be able to access that part of the value chain. Then disruptions are always, present in the domestic market, and government policy has to ensure fair competition for the domestic firms. Then lack of support in operational areas, particularly in design activities, can become a very big handicap. So we end with what are the other relevant issues? Central policies are key. State level policies can be more granular, as in China and Vietnam, but central policies, particularly in FDI promotion and trade facilitation, are key. State policies also need the support of the center. Stability and consistency of policies is crucial for expanding exports. If you change your tariffs frequently or change the FDI regulations or standards or other such things, then it is very difficult to attract parts of the GVC. Timely and efficient implementation of policies such as PLI, ROTTEP, etc. becomes crucial for achieving investment and expanding exports. Finally, we come to the recommendations, and here we'd like to point out that time is very important because there is a small window of 1 to 4 years before other economies may take over. So it's very important that we focus on establishing scale, GVCs and export momentum within the next 3 to 5 years. We must encourage the relocation of GVCs, and here we can actually improve Advantage India by relocating lead firms and their tier 1 to tier 3 suppliers to India. We should reduce tariffs on inputs to become competitive. We should reduce policy-related operational burdens and delays on a priority basis. Stability is key. Systematic and periodic consultation with major stakeholders is a necessity. And the critical role of Indian industry and domestic champions in skill development and in connecting competitively with GVCs should become a priority area. And we need specific policies to nurture domestic champions along with global GVCs. There should be a mechanism for monitoring and measuring progress on policies, just as the PLI has one, which is a very effective mechanism. Then we should also address gaps in effective and timely timely implementation through periodic consultation. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, sir and ma'am, for the insightful presentation. I will now request Shri Hari Om Rai, CMD Lava Mobiles, to give his remarks.
Honorable Minister, Honorable Secretary, and member at the dais, and also the media. आज बहुत ऐतिहासिक दिन है। मतलब ये जब इस रिपोर्ट के बारे में जो प्राइम मिनिस्टर ने बोला, जो थॉट बोले और उस थॉट से जो विजनरी रिपोर्ट निकली है, ये बहुत ऐतिहासिक है। और उसके अलावा इस ऐतिहासिक सफलता, इस ऐतिहासिक दिन को सफल बनाने के लिए मैं बहुत स्पष्टता से कहना चाहूंगा कि जो हमारे मिनिस्टर साहब जो आए हैं, राजीव चंद्रशेखर जी, उनके साथ मेरी कुछ इंटरैक्शंस हुई हैं और उनके बारे में पता लगा है। एक एंटरप्रेन्योर थे और एंटरप्रेन्योर से एक लीड कर रहे हैं हमारे इलेक्ट्रॉनिक्स को, जो मोस्ट वैल्यूएबल सेगमेंट है वर्ल्ड की। और इनकी जो एंटरप्रेन्योरियल एबिलिटीज हैं, जिसकी वजह से लीड कर रहे हैं। सुबह 8 बजे मुझे पता लगा, इवन सैटरडे संडे के दिन ऑफिस में होते हैं और रात तक काम करते हैं। तो इस ऐतिहासिक दिन और इस ऐतिहासिक लीडर के सामने ये रिपोर्ट आ रही है। मैं आपको कुछ शब्दों में बताना चाहूंगा कि कैसे ऐतिहासिक है, और इसके लिए आई हैव टू टेल 3 points, just 3, that it is a very big strategic shift in the history of this nation of India. Number 1. Number 2, how it is going to impact this strategic shift, how it is going to impact the nation. And number 3, what all is required. Most of it has been covered in this, what all is required, so I'll not delve upon that in deeper aspects, but why? And to let you know about why, that it is a big strategic shift and it is a historic day, I have to let you know the context in which we are seeing this particular report. Most of us consider 1991 to be a great reform, and I think that has of course taken India forward, but in my mind there have been large mistakes in that reform. And why that has happened? Because despite the economy grew, but it grew because of speculation and lending which happened in the country. Because when the foreign capital came, it grew because the speculation happened into land and secondary market and lending, and some bit happened due to shallow manufacturing of the market access in India. That's all. We could not build the desired skills required to build this nation and grow this nation to a different level altogether. And let me also, share with you that as an outcome today where we stand, so that we understand, the context very well. We were 25% of the global economy. When the Britishers left us, they left us at 3.9% of the global economy. We were 3.9% in 1947. In the last 75 years, we have brought it down to 3.2%. So in the last 75 years, from 3.9% to 3.2%. Therefore, we have to understand that most of what we have done is not done a favor to India. And therefore, it is truly a historic day. And why? Because we think that India is a very large market somehow. We have a wrong notion about that, despite that we are just 3.2% of the global GDP. If we are 3.2% of the global GDP, despite we are 18% people of the world, but our consumption cannot be more than 3.2% of the global consumption. Which means that even in electronics, let's say mobile, because it's so close to our hearts, we consume about 4 to 5% value of the global mobile consumption. What it means clearly that you can't manufacture, you can't build an ecosystem just by targeting 4%, 5%, of the global total requirement. You can't build scale, you can't build ecosystem. And what we need to take, 18% लोग हैं साहब हम दुनिया के, और 18% लोग मात्र 3.2% जीडीपी पे जीते हैं. हमें अपनी जीडीपी बेयर मिनिमम 18% करने के लिए विश्व की जीडीपी का सीना चीर के अपने पास गरीब लोगों को सर्व करने के लिए लाना पड़ेगा, और उसके लिए एक्सपोर्ट इज द की. और इसके बाद ये कैसे कंट्री को बदलेगा, हाउ इट इज गोइंग टू चेंज द कंट्री इज वेरी इंपॉर्टेंट. जस्ट 3 स्टेप्स. देखिए, जब लार्ज ग्लोबल कॉम्पिटिटिव फर्म्स क्रिएट होती हैं कंट्री के अंदर, और मैं चाइना जब जाता हूं तो चाइना में देखता हूं कि छोटे छोटे रेस्टोरेंट्स भी 100 लाइन से लगे हुए हैं और 100 के 100 रेस्टोरेंट में भीड़ है. यहां जब हम जाते हैं तो देखते हैं रेस्टोरेंट्स खुलते हैं तो मुश्किल से कई रेस्टोरेंट बेचारे चलते हैं, कई फटाफट बंद होते रहते हैं, नई दुकानें खुलती रहती हैं, नई चीजें बंद होती रहती हैं. हमारा जो देश है इतना बड़ा होने के बावजूद भी एंटरप्राइज की अपॉर्चुनिटी नहीं क्रिएट करी हुई है. एग्रीकल्चर में फार्मर्स ज्यादा उगा दें तो फसलें सड़ जाती हैं क्योंकि कंजम्पशन भी. सो ये जो एक्सपोर्ट्स है और जो लार्ज ग्लोबल फर्म्स हैं, चाइना में एप्पल जैसे मैन्युफैक्चरर के अगेंस्ट में एक एक फैक्ट्री के अंदर 10-10 लाख लोग काम करते हैं, यानी कि एक एक सिटी बन जाती है. और जब ऐसी सिटीज क्रिएट होती हैं तो बहुत जबरदस्त कंजम्पशन होती है और एग्रीकल्चर की कंजम्पशन होती है, बहुत सारे लोगों को रोजगार के अवसर प्राप्त होते हैं. तो ऐसी स्थिति में जब एग्रीकल्चर की खूब कंजम्पशन होती है तो मैन्युफैक्चरिंग भी जो और मैन्युफैक्चर करता है उसको एग्रीकल्चर कंज्यूम करने लगता है, और इस तरीके से वर्चुअस इकोनॉमी हम क्रिएट कर पाते हैं. तो मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट चीज जो बड़ा स्ट्रेटेजिक शिफ्ट है वो ये दिमाग का शिफ्ट है कि हम मात्र इंडिया को सर्व नहीं करेंगे, हम विश्व को सर्व करेंगे. ये आत्मनिर्भर भारत के बियॉन्ड कदम है और इसलिए ये बहुत ऐतिहासिक है. और लास्टली क्या करना पड़ेगा, बहुत सारी बातें मेरे मित्र ने कह दी हैं, बट आई वुड लाइक टू स्टिल से दैट what we need finally are 2 things: skill and scale. Scale and skill. Because once we will develop skill at a globally competitive scale, at the lower per capita of ours, we are roughly 17% of Chinese per capita. Nobody can be more competitive than us in the world than India, because we have a large market also. So it is the time for us to actually do that, and a lot of other steps have already been said in this, so I will not take more time. But it is going to be the next step of Atmanirbhar Bharat. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for helping us to understand how the strategic shift of Government of India to the global market is going to help the country. I now invite Sri Vinod Bhatia, Chairman FICCI National Committee on ICT and Mobile Manufacturing. He will be joining us over video.
Can't listen.
पानी की Grazie. Electronics is for Pankaj Hariom Ketan friends in the street. A very good evening and thank you for giving me this opportunity to contribute at today's event. Honorable Mr. Shri Lalita Shikhaji, Secretary Mechi, Shri Alessandro, Secretary Electronics, Shri Saul Gaur, Pankaj Mahindra, Hariom Ketan, friends from the industry, ladies and gentlemen. A very good evening and thank you for giving me this opportunity to contribute at today's event. As the chair of the FICCI National Committee on ICTs and Mobile Manufacturing, we believe this is a really important day and the vision document substantively contributes to the vision that the Honorable Prime Minister laid down for electronics manufacturing, specifically with regards to exports and building India's share in the GVCs. Something that he not only alluded to but emphasized on during his two speeches in August. The report also substantively, we hope, will lay down the roadmap for contributing to a $300 billion electronics manufacturing industry, which is a critical part of the $1 trillion digital economy, which in turn is critical for the $5 trillion GDP. In specific terms, this report breaks down the various sections and steps that are required to achieve the vision that the Honorable Prime Minister laid down. It speaks about the need for electronics to lead the way, which is very critical because it's largely globally traded commodity. It speaks about a specific action plan for 1,000 days to reach that milestone. It also identifies key challenges in specific terms. It talks about the need to shift the ecosystem and what it will take to do that. It speaks about costs and the need to reduce those to be continuously competitive. It talks about tariffs and its impact on competitiveness. It also compares India with competing economies to see where we stand in terms of competitiveness and tariffs, costs, etc. It also touches upon the whole area of domestic valuation and how that is impacted with scale and exports, because that's a critical parameter that the government and the industry wants to achieve. It does a specific deep dive into the area of scale. It compares India's numbers vis-a-vis the global opportunity. As you know, we do about $70 billion of domestic manufacturing. 5% of the global smartphone and mobile market is in India, and about 2% of the IT hardware. So clearly a long way to go, which is also the hope that the Honorable Prime Minister has built out in his comments. The Meiji has already been doing a fantastic job in terms of building this sector. My heartiest congratulations to the various dignitaries present today. The one thing that this report also focuses on is the issue of domestic challenges. It talks about their needs to link with GVCs and how that can be done. It also focuses on their requirements, funding and design capability. Very, very important for building a domestic industry. Finally, it speaks about building skills, because that's critical. The Honorable Minister, as you know, is also responsible for the skills ministry, so it nicely comes together. And it ends with the need for outlining a stable policy regime. Again, many thanks for having me. This is a really important milestone, first of the two volumes that we hope to produce at the industry in meeting the Prime Minister's vision. My deepest and sincerest thanks for allowing me this opportunity to participate. Thank you, and my very best.
Thank you, sir, for your remarks and the fact that electronics has to pave the way forward. I request Sri Ketan Patel, MDHP, to please give his remarks.
Thank you, Virat. Honorable Minister Rajesh Chandrasekharji, Honorable Secretary Ji Ajay JS Saurabh Gaur, and all the dignitaries, press, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. As Hariom Ji rightly mentioned, this is an amazing time for the country, and on behalf of the industry representation, I would like to congratulate Honorable Prime Minister, who laid the objective for India to be a significant player with enhanced participation in the GVCs and creating new opportunities to engage in global trade by expanding both markets as well as products. I think it's important that we look at opportunities which are available in the country to go into which all markets and which all product categories, because electronics is such a vast sector. We need to pick our battles well and focus on areas where we have better chance of success. This is very inspiring and an extremely welcome step towards India's growth. A country which has huge potential and ability to give scale to the global industry at a very different level, and the amount of skills what we have through tremendous knowledge base and education we have in the country, this is a lifetime opportunity for the country. What is further motivating is the way Honorable Minister of State Rajiv Chandrasekhar Ji, Secretary of JS Meeti and the team are working relentlessly to make this vision a reality. Strategy is one, ladies and gentlemen, but most of the time strategy fails without execution. And I think we have a great team, and we have seen them working over the last 3-4 months in terms of how at speed, what speed they are really going after this is very heartening to see from the industry perspective. That gives confidence that there is enough motivation and commitment from the government to make this a success. The report covers some important points, but I wanted to highlight few very important areas to make this vision a reality. And there are 4 broad areas which I want to touch upon. The report covers a lot of details, but 4 areas are extremely critical for making things successful. Number 1, the WTO compliant schemes are very important for the country to see how we are doing and leveraging that for attracting various suppliers. Second, but the most important thing is end-to-end competitiveness. End of the day, we are competing with the global world, and every single dollar of cost matters, direct or indirect cost. And it's important that that is getting addressed through various initiatives and the kind of scale we bring in as a country. Third, when you want to be a globally competitive and export-oriented manufacturer or country, quality is something which we cannot compromise. And that's why cost versus quality balance is something which is extremely critical. And exporting out means you need to produce top-class quality, and you need to give various sets of different kind of quality range of products and solutions to the global world. And last but most important is the industry cannot be developed without developing an ecosystem. And ecosystem development takes decades. Some of the economies which we are talking about has taken 2 decades to build ecosystem, and India wants to cover this in a very short time. So it requires a very different approach than a traditional approach what has been taken by a lot of economies in the past. At broad level, GVCs can be split into 4 key stakeholders, which are again very important in this entire thing to make it successful, and all 4 have to come together in making this a success. Number 1, the leading companies, global as well as the local brands which are operating in India. They are the manufacturers, they are the brands who are operating across various product categories in the electronics sector. Second, contract manufacturers who manufacture on behalf of the prominent brands. Number 3 is the platform leaders that supply core products to other brands. And finally, the suppliers who supply components, modules, sub-assemblies to contract manufacturers of this form. If any of this is broken, this is not going to be a success. And it's important that we are covering all these 4 stakeholders very well in what they require to make this a scalable model. Hence, setting up efficient GVCs in the country needs nurturing through various areas, and I want to talk about 7 broad things. Number 1, scale. As Hariomji also said, scale and skill. Without that, it's not never going to be possible. Scale will bring in the level of expertise, and economies of scale brings in the kind of cost competitiveness as well as the expertise and technical capabilities what you require. Second, we have to provide favorable investment climate, and I think it is coming straight from the Honorable Prime Minister, so I'm sure this will make a difference. Supporting policies along with the seamless infrastructure such as port clearances, competitive trade costs, clean and continuous power, skilled workforce, etc. They are very important elements to make it successful. incentives both at capital investments level as well as production linked incentives, labor costs, lower tariffs for intermediate inputs, and direct and indirect taxes, which are globally competitive. With all this, we will be definitely able to look at those four key stakeholders which I spoke about and make this a very solid value proposition which could attract the global world. Although electronics is among the fastest growing export sectors in India, it's still very relatively small. Some of the speakers already spoke about compared to China and Vietnam. Besides, we are also competing with economies like Mexico, Thailand, who are also competing to attract business in India. And hence, it is important to make sure that how we are globally competitive and how we are making sure that we are providing ease of doing business across all the various elements of the value chain. In summary, I think it's a great step. Clearly, coming from Honorable Prime Minister and the commitment Honorable Minister Ji has, India has a clear advantage and opportunity. This is the right time. I've said this in the past also for India to capture this moment. As a lot of global firms are already present in India, a lot of local companies are very motivated to scale at a very different level. Technology is available, skills can be built into this country given the kind of education profile we have. And incentives have already started kicking in, and media has done a phenomenal job to consider some of the key sectors of the electronics and provide the first step on PLI. That's a great first step to start with. So with the right vision of the Honorable Prime Minister, great commitment from Honorable Minister, as an industry member, I feel very confident that we have a great future ahead. And if we focus on some of the key elements what we spoke today, I think sky is the limit. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir, for giving us a global perspective and how global value chain needs attention around incentives, cost competitiveness, quality standards, and ecosystem development. I request Shri Ajay Sahani, Secretary, Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, to kindly give the address.
Respected Minister Shri Rajiv Chandrasekhar Ji, Shri Pankaj Manju Ji, Shri Ketan Patel Ji, Shri Hariom Rai Ji, Raj Bhatia who has joined us on DC, my colleagues Saurav and his entire team in West India team, also Harshvardhan Singh Ji and Tina Jha Ji, and others who have contributed to this report, and ladies and gentlemen for present here today. It's a wonderful feeling to be a part of this launch of this new report. I would like to thank ICR for taking the effort to pool expertise, to do industry-wide consultation, and to come up with a very timely report which starts from where we have arrived, where we have reached, and takes a deep look at where we want to be. Over the past 6 years, our journey has been quite significant. From $29 billion of manufacturing in the electronic sector, we were able to move for 5 years at a very vigorous pace of 23% year on year, to get to a total of $76 billion in 2019-20. In that, mobile and a few other segments were particularly, they registered spectacular growth. It was stupendous growth. The pandemic year caused a bit of it was a different year. Some factories remained shut for a few months. In spite of the very serious nature of the pandemic and the impact it had across all the industries, we were able to maintain our level of overall production. we still remain at $75 billion in 2021. And for the next 5 years, our plans, our aspirations, and these are not aspirations of Nike, these are aspirations of India, these are aspirations of the industry, these are aspirations of the people. These aspirations today, if we assess where we expect to be in 5 years, we should be moving from $75 billion to $250 billion in 5 years, with a CAGR this time of 27%. I have rarely, stood in any podium and been able to announce a 27% CAGR. That is the aim that we have set for ourselves, and that is where we need to now revisit and reassess what we are attempting to do, how do we change our course, what do we do differently to be able to sustain this level of growth and to set the stage for moving even further beyond these next 5 years. So in that, our national policy on electronics actually gives some hints. Move from import substitution to exports. Move from protection merely by tariff and other mechanisms to everything that we need to do to become globally competitive. Because without competitiveness, there cannot be exports. Exports will happen when you are in the particular thing that we are exporting. There's some edge that we have been able to develop, either technologically or price point-wise. So develop that competitiveness in more and more and more areas. And move from mobiles, which is one of the most extraordinary and most sophisticated parts of electronic industry, move to a much wider spectrum of products. Do not stay at what Hariomji mentioned as shallow manufacturing. Go deeper. So take a look at every single raw material, every single component, every single sub-assembly. And it is not necessary to find our panacea only in a finished product. It's quite possible at some point, and we have to remain alive to that possibility, that we find a sweet spot in very specific sub-assemblies. For the past few years, we have brought in so much of SMT lines and PCB assembly. It's quite possible that today we do PCB assembly itself better than most other geographies. Maybe, almost any other geography. So those are the spots that we have to find, and those are the spots that we have to concentrate on, in which these concepts are exceptionally important and handy. That not just the domestic value addition ratio, but overall domestic value addition. Because that is finally the measure of what you are improving and what goes into the GDP. GDP is not made up of the mere domestic value addition ratio. It is made up of domestic value addition, the aggregate, which is basically what has come out so beautifully in this report. So, and I have the confidence, and I think the report also takes us in that direction, that one of the best ways to do this is through addressing scale. If we are able to address scale, there is an automatic magnet for bringing in components, for bringing in sub-assemblies, for bringing in everything that is missing. Because then, once you have scaled, the impatience with stretched supply chains is much higher. So then automatically there is scale not just for the main product manufacturer but also for the components and the sub-assemblies. So hopefully we'll get there. It has to be a complete and comprehensive ecosystem, not leaving any gaps whatsoever. So, but a very timely report. It will be extremely useful in our journey as we move from being as Hariomji said, 3.2% to a much higher percentage that we aspire. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be a part of it.
Thank you so much, sir, for your kind words and the clear goal setting. I humbly request Sri Rajiv Chandrasekhar, Honorable Minister of State, Electronics and Information Technology, Skill Development and Entrepreneurship, to release the vision document. Thank you so much, sir. Request the Honorable Minister of State, Electronics and Information Technology and Skill Development and Entrepreneurship to please give the keynote address.